Hello, David Blakey here. This Python video is another getting started video, and it's called Using the Python Interpreter. A simple and short introduction to the Python interpreter. Once you've installed Python, once you've figured out where it is, last video I showed you Python-V, which shows the Python version. I'm now going to show you what happens when we invoke Python without any argument, the -v of course being not an argument but a flag. When we call Python directly from the command line, we are presented not just with the version number that we're using, and some other information, but a 3-character prompt at the end of the output and a cursor. Now what's happening right now is that we're still running Python. So this was not just a simple command that returns us to the command line. You can see the Unix command line here is not available. What we have instead is this prompt, which is Python waiting for us to type some Python code. It's called the interactive prompt, and it allows us to talk to Python directly. In the next video, we're going to look at writing programs using a text file, which is the way we'll write most of our programs. But I want to make sure that you are familiar with the Python interpreter, the command line interpreter, because it's very, very useful to be able to type out snippets of Python code and get an immediate response. It just takes longer to write out a program on a text file and then to run it. It takes extra steps. Sometimes you're just interested in running just a little bit of Python code and seeing what the result might be. So let's start doing that. What we can do is write regular Python code that assigns values to variables. So we might have a variable called A and a variable called B, and we're assigning integer values to each one. We can then print A and see the result, print B and see the result. But what's interesting is if we just type A by itself, just putting in A, you see the result of A anyway. And that's because what the Python interpreter does is give you the value or the evaluated value of anything that you typed. We might, for example, say A plus B, and we get back 15. Of course, there's no difference in this case between saying print A plus B and A plus B. That's because, again, Python evaluates the last value of anything that you typed and shows it to you. Shows a string representation of that value. So when we say A plus B, we get 15. We can say A minus B, and we'll get -5. But we can go much further than that. And these are very simple examples. Where the Python interpreter shines is when you want to do something, you're not quite sure whether it's going to work or not, and you want to test out a snippet of code. We might, for example, create a list, and maybe we were interested in finding out whether you could put a list. This is the for construct. Now, you haven't learned this yet. Actually, maybe I'll do a little background. We can create a list called myList and give it a set of values. As you can see, we've given it 3 string values. We've created a list using the square brackets. All this will be covered later in the term, but for an example, I might show you this. And then I might also want to show you how we can loop through this list. Now what I did here was, in the first line there, I created a new list, and in the second line I used a for construct. The for construct says, let's look through each element in the list. Now, as I say again, this is not something I'm trying to teach you right now. I will teach it to you later and in a later video as well. But just as an example, the for construct says, give me each element separately and assign each element in my list to I. So I will contain A and then B and then C as the loop progresses. Notice in the second line after the for, I have print I. But do you see on the left the 3 dots? The 3 dots indicates an indent, and an indent means a block is expected, and so we're going to indent. Let's do that again. I start with for I in my list. Now this is a block, the beginning of a block, and again we'll go over this later, so you don't need to understand it completely, and don't worry if you don't. But needless to say, a for block needs to be indented. So when I type for I in my list, Python identifies that I'm beginning a block. Oops. We got an error. What's wrong with this? Let's try again. For I in my list. Okay, it worked. I don't know what I did differently. That's very odd. Oh, I missed the in. Okay, so when we say for I in my list, you see the ellipsis on the left there, right? Now, Python hasn't indented for us, but it's indicating to us that this is the beginning of a loop. So an indent will be required here. We then say print I. Now, what this constructs is a loop that loops through the elements in my list. And for each element in my list, whatever's in the block gets executed, which means that the print statement is going to get executed 3 times. And that's why when we hit return twice, we see A, B, and C. Now notice that I had to hit return twice, and why? Well, Python wants to know if there's another line to the block. Something else may happen. You know, we might want to say hello here. Then it says, okay, are you done with the block yet? If you're done with the block, you can hit enter. If you're not, you can type something to the left margin. We'll get into all of this later. The thing that I'm trying to communicate right now is that this block is something that Python holds on to before executing it. So it knows we're not done yet. So it allows us to create multi-line pieces of code to be executed later, right? That is, to be executed when we're done. So we're done with the block now, and we hit return, and we get a response. Now, let's look at the result. As you can see, Python looped through my list, right? Element by element, that is A, B, and C, and first printed the element, and then, still within the block, printed hello. You can see by looking at the loop what happened. Now again, we're not going over this specifically, but what I just want to show you is what's possible within the Python interpreter. For example, maybe we're not sure what's in my list and we don't see it anymore. Maybe we just want to see what's in my list. We can just type my list and you get the result, which is what's the value of my list. My list has A, B, and C in it. This is how we originally initialized it. So as you can see, it's possible to write small snippets of code within the interpreter and then have them be executed directly. We might say, oh, well, you know, I wonder how append works. Now, again, this is something that we're going to talk about later, but maybe we want to append a new element to my list. We append, and then we check out my list to see what's in it, A, B, C, and D. Perfect. That's exactly what we want, allowing us to work within Python, to use Python constructs and Python syntax, and then to see the result immediately. Now, I've had students ask me, why do we need this if we have other ways of running Python? And in fact, most of the time we'll be running Python using a text file, which I'll go into in the next video. The answer is, this is just a simple, easy, quick way to test stuff out. You may be working with a new module, a new library within Python, or maybe you're not quite sure how something works. For example, if you're right at the beginning of your learning, you may ask, well, does append to the end or does it append to the beginning? Or if I was to use the pop function, what would I get? If I use the pop function with no argument, what would I get? Well, interesting, it pops it off the end, it looks like, doesn't it? I might have thought that it was going to pop off the beginning. Also, you may ask, well, does pop remove the element completely or does it just return the element and leave it in my list? Well, let's find out. We'll find out what's in my list. You can see that D has been removed. Now, again, I'm not trying to teach all of this to you now. All I'm trying to show you is that it's possible in the command line interpreter to get answers to your questions really, really quickly. We might, for example, want to know what's in my list. What are the methods available in my list? We'll go over this later. Well, we can say a dir my list and get an answer right away. These things are extremely useful, and I, even as an advanced user of Python, am using the command line interpreter constantly. So I encourage you to use it as well. To get out of the command line interpreter, we use the quit function. In other versions of Python, you may need to use Control D, which also works, or possibly Control Z if you are working within Windows. But and also, whether you're in Windows or in the Mac or on just a regular flavor of Unix, you're going to find that the Python interpreter works in the exact same way, with very few, if any, variations. So that's the Python command interpreter. And all I want to say is thank you for listening, and let me know if you have any questions or comments about this video.